get started, this is a particularly fun tour for a lot of us. So thank you all for coming. My name is Eric, and I run the Greenwich Village Literary Pub Crawl and the Brooklyn Literary Pub Crawl and all its offshoots as part of Bootscrape Entertainment. We started doing the virtual tours during the pandemic when that's what you did and everyone did. And we found that we actually really enjoyed them quite a bit, partially because we could expand off of some of our material. We could talk about writers that maybe we don't always get to delve into quite as deeply. We weren't confined by how far a person can walk or where the closest pub is. And so we could really expand a lot of the material that we use. And we found it to be very enjoyable, and thus we have continued on, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I will say that our live tours are back in action. We have tours all the way through the end of November scheduled right now. So if you haven't joined us before, I hope you get a chance to come check us out. And you can also, I'm supposed to tell you, you can find us on the internets, one of the darkest place that humans have ever created, Facebook, Twitter, well, I guess it's X now, Instagram, and our website, literarypubcrawl.com. But with that said, I'd like to introduce the rest of the team so we can jump right in, because we have lots of really fun research material to join up. So Rose, Becca, Rob, why don't you unmute your cameras, if you will. We got a fun little bit together. I want to do some quick intros to everybody here. I'll begin with Danielle Brockmann. Danielle has been with us for quite some time now, helping us both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and beside the scenes and looming over the scenes. Wherever there's a scene, there's Danielle. She's known as the Brock by all of her friends, or, well, actually, no, I don't think that's true at all. I think it's only but me, but I call her the Brock. Actually, I've never done that until right now, but now I am going to call her the Brock moving forward. She has been a wonderful guide. She's a great presenter, wonderful researcher. She's a blessing to the team, and she's a real rock or rock of stability for our tour. Next, Rose Merritt. What can be said about Rose that hasn't been said about any wonderful human? She joined us after watching one of our earliest pandemic tours, and she joined up really quickly and immediately began to elevate our product. Her insight is one of the reasons that our script structure tends to be so strong and the material is really good and refined. She's got a really keen eye and a keen ear to material and a real passion for what we do, and her participation is very appreciated. As we approach Halloween, we do wonder if she is named Rose because by any other name she'd be as sweet, or is it because indeed every rose has a thorn? We shall see. Next, Rebecca Ross Bailey. Becca Ross Bailey. Good old RRB. Herb, if you will. She hails from my home state of Maine, and some of her earliest professional theater work was at the same theater as some of my earliest professional theater work, Penobscot Theater in Bangor, Maine. Lately, she's been putting in a lot of time helping to deal with the minutiae of running this tour, and it's been incredibly appreciated. And I think she's going to be key to really kind of help moving us forward as well. She and Danielle are really fundamental to putting together tonight's presentation. So if you do enjoy this evening, apart from obviously the presentation of all five of us, the work that Danielle and Rebecca put into this is really key to making it happen. Finally, we have Robert Gonyo. He is a stalwart guide. He's a director and an actor and a musician. He runs Haunted Manhattan, which is a regular tour sharing the ghost stories of New York, and this is prime time season for him. Rob is, however, a complicated man. He has about 17 different mood swings and 9 different functional personalities, and we never know which one is going to show up. So this could be a very interesting evening, depending on... Oh, there it is! So with that said, I'm going to begin some of the slideshow, because you will notice that many of us are in costume, obviously, is the spirit of Halloween. I myself had chosen Robin Hood because Robin Hood was one of my favorite literary figures. Many people have depicted Robin Hood throughout the years, some better than others. I actually have a childhood story when I was homesick one day and was watching TV and was surprised to see a black and white Robin Hood movie. Little did I know, I don't care for his performance of it, but this one I really like. But that particular sick day, it ended up being a Robin Hood marathon all day long that I didn't realize. And it became one of the coolest sick days ever. I must have been like 3rd or 4th grade, I think. Home alone, but appropriately looked after. We were latchkey kids at that time. But every other sick day after that never quite could meet up because I was always looking for that other Robin Hood marathon. It just never happened again when I was sick. Of the many, many movies of Robin Hood, I think my favorite, which to me is the clear winner, is this one right here, It is Michael Praed's depiction of Robin of Sherwood in the BBC show of the 1980s. It ran for 3 seasons, I believe. He was the main first season, and it is it's to me it's the best. It's perfectly 80s, as you can tell by his hairstyle. It's perfectly cheesy. It's also incredibly endearing and nostalgic, and it has a huge following. Even now, people will still go to different Comic Cons and see if any of the cast will show up. For a brief period of time, Jason Connery, Sean Connery's son, took over the helm of Robin of Sherwood, and they really lean heavily into the Celtic mythos of the Robin Hood character with Herne the Hunter, as you can see here, which is, yes, a guy with a deer for a hat. And they really kind of play that part of it. The Guy of Gisborne and Sheriff of Nottingham, their dynamic is so fun and goofy and intense. And it actually received a lot of rewards for fairly honestly depicting costumes and set decoration and a lot of the vibe of the time. So I encourage you to watch it. It is what you expect from a 1980s BBC show, but it's still worth the watch. Now, we have had the occasional haunted story on our tour. In fact, what was formerly our first stop, the White Horse Tavern, was known to be a haunted tavern. We don't quite go there anymore because it's turned into a bit of a schmarmy Wall Street bro kind of vibe, and that's not really our vibe. So the White Horse Tavern is dead to us, and thus it's a good ghostly tale to share. But Dylan Thomas, depicted here both in a picture and in a vine, which were two of his favorite places to be depicted, allegedly drank himself to death there. It is alleged and probably unlikely, but still makes a good tale. And thus his spirit must haunt these halls. Now, if you are one who is skeptical, I do have two chilling tales of the macabre that might sway your opinion otherwise. Now, the first is one night, it was late at night, the busboy was cleaning off all the tables, the bar was closed, and he walked by Dylan Thomas's favorite table. And there on the table was an empty glass of whiskey. Now, if you're still unconvinced and that didn't convince you that it was a haunting, I have another scary tale of horror from the White Horse Tavern. And once again, a busboy, perhaps the same one looking for danger pay, walked by Dylan Thomas's table, and it was askew, as if somebody had gotten up and walked away. Probably because somebody earlier had gotten up and walked away. But despite all of these convincing or unconvincing stories, noted psychics have been there. Noted psychics. And they have felt the presence of Dylan Thomas. Now, as Kurt, one of our other guides, might say, if you are a noted psychic and you show up to a haunted tavern and you don't feel the spirit of Dylan Thomas, you might not get referrals to other haunted taverns. So it is in their best interest to find something. But I digress. There's much more interesting stories to tell than what I have to share here. So I think it's time that we jump into the tour as we get into chapter 1, where our own internal spiritual guide will share some of the history of Halloween and touch upon her own thoughts of the noted psychics. And so without further ado, I give you the kookiest and spookiest tour in New York with some Halloween history. I give you chapter 1, the Brockmanning. Danielle?
Oh wow, what an entrance I just received. I didn't know that we were supposed to be debuting our looks. You might think that I'm dressed up in costume as a late 1800s magician, but I'm actually not. What Eric's not telling you is that he brought me here in a seance, and I truly am the embodiment of the spirit of a late 1800s magician. And because we only run on donations and we're mostly volunteer, he can only afford my services for the night. So, I mean, at midnight, it's quite literally, that's it for me. Curtain closes. So we're going to start with a little bit of a backstory on Halloween. So when you think about Halloween in New York City, you might think of lavish costume parties, ghost tours, and of course the village Halloween parade. But Halloween started from the Celtic festival of Samhain. The Celts from Ireland, England, and France celebrated the end of summer's harvest and dressed in costumes to ward off spirits, had bonfires and fortune-telling, and even animal sacrifices. They believed that the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead were thinnest that night, so it would allow ghosts to return and perhaps damage some crops, and also provide a little bit of spiritual guidance to predict the future. The Celts were eventually conquered by the Romans, who in late October commemorated the dead and honored Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees, aka apples. And then in the 8th century, the Catholic Church got involved, like they do, as the buzzkill they are, when Pope Gregory III declared November 1st as All Saints' Day, and in the 9th century, November 2nd was declared All Souls' Day. And this incorporated many Celtic traditions to lure the pagans to Christianity, which they did pretty successfully. And thus the evening before is known as All Hallows' Eve or Halloween. It wasn't until the mid-19th century, when Irish immigrants came to America en masse, that Halloween really began to take root. Hence the turnip.
Ew.
Jokes only get better from here, I promise.
Do they? Do they?
Yes, we're going to manifest it. Trick-or-treating gained popularity through the 1920s to 1950s, and New York City's first Greenwich Village Halloween parade was hosted in 1973 by puppeteer Ralph Lee, and it continues to this day. But New York was always a hotbed of spiritual activity, and as we like to say, the writers in town were also heavy on the spirits. See, slightly better.
Do they get better, really?
In the mid-1700s, Emanuel Swedenborg had a spiritual awakening at 53 and began having visions and dreams that Jesus Christ appointed him to write the heavenly doctrine to reform Christianity. And he had fans all over the world, including the Queen of Sweden and also Immanuel Kant. Many writers were influenced by his work, including Frost, Blake, Emerson, Strindberg, Balzac, and even Carl Jung and Helen Keller. His followers began the new church based on his writings, and it first opened a location in New York in the financial district, and then they moved to Midtown location in 1859, which unfortunately went up for sale until September 2020, sadly. Oddly, it was purchased by the Serbian government for $15 million. I don't really have any theories on that. It's just weird. Franz Mesmer was a German doctor who discovered animal magnetism or mesmerism, and his writings are the foundation of magnetizers, mesmerists, or as we now call them, hypnotists. These two ideologies came together in the Poughkeepsie Seer, aka Andrew Jackson, wrong one, Andrew Jackson Davis, right one. They're very similar. They have like hair and glasses and a long face. He was a notable psychic and popularized spiritualism in North America. During the time of the Civil War, the Fox sisters, Kate, Margaretta, and Leah from Hydesville, New York, were infamous for their parlor seances. In 1888, Margaretta confessed that it was a hoax, and their reputation was ruined completely. She tried to recant in 1889, but unfortunately the damage was already done. By 1893, all sisters had died in poverty. However, that still didn't sway public belief. The validity of such performances was intensely debated from all aspects of society, including formal academic symposiums that were hosted at Columbia University, and also a formal petition for the New York State Congressional Office to request an actual telegram to be sent between heaven and earth. This paved the cosmic ladder for Madame Blavatsky in 1875 to found the Theosophical Society. She claimed to be able to prove that spiritualism was real and that mediums were making contact with entities or shells of the deceased, but not the spirit itself. Notable theosophists include the great thief, Thomas Edison, and Rudolf Steiner, who later developed anthroposophy and Waldorf education. You can still visit the Theosophical Society's bookshop called Quest on East 53rd Street. And if you've ever been on our in-person Greenwich Village Literary Pub Crawl tour, you've heard us share the tea on the relationship between writers and beverages and the police, as during the Prohibition, bars masqueraded as tea houses with a heavy pour. Well, in the 1930s, tea houses would gain a reputation for spirits of a different kind. So right now, I think is a great time for us to do a toast. So does everybody have their drink ready?
Absolutely.
I have my nice literary pub crawl glass ready. The best way... Oh, sorry?
No, sorry, I was going to say, I was just seeing who other guys had their literary pub crawl glasses handy or whatnot. For shame.
It's in the kitchen. Does that count?
Yeah, that counts. That's close. It's being washed because you've been using it so frequently.
Yeah, because it ate.
So the best way to keep the spirits away is to have a spirit a day. Cheers.
Cheers.
So on April 17th, 1929, which is very important because that's my birthday, Maquette, Cuba was fined $100, or as in today, $1,799. Actually, from the last time we did this tour in 2021, that amount was $1,500, so that makes me really sad. For illegal fortune telling at the Gypsy Tea Room on Fifth Avenue. Fortune tellers were prohibited from being paid by the tea houses or clients directly, so they could only accept tips. Undercover police officers Mary Vaughn and Lillian Harrison would pay 25 cents for a tea reading as part of an NYPD trap in the war against tea rooms of occult nomenclature. Tea rooms were for ladies, and that New York City Police Department would need a woman and a female cop specifically for this war. Police officer Mary Sullivan was the first homicide detective and psychic jailer, head of New York's policewomen, leading over 100 convictions in 6 months. On April 20th, 1934, the Gypsy Den, the Romany Tea Garden, and the Gypsy Sandwich Shop were all raided. Like Maquette, Romany Marie and her caravan of bars and tea houses, the kind that Vanity Fair editors and Edna St. Vincent Millay would frequent, they were raided often. And you could also learn more about that on our Greenwich Village literary pub crawl tour in person. Speaking of stories, though, about detectives and magicians, this is what I'm really excited about. Finally, we're here for our transatlantic ghost tale. I don't know why I agreed to be filmed in that light.
Yeah. Part of your contract when we summoned you.
Spiritual contract. In the 1890s, this lame magician named Harry Houdini read books like Revelations of a Spirit Medium to gain tips on how to be an illusionist. Before he became known as the Handcuff King, he and his wife Beatrice, or Bess, seen here, trapped inside of a box, hosted spiritualistic entertainments to keep food on the table. Houdini wrote a few books, including A Magician Among the Spirits in 1924, which is still in print today and will be on your mandatory reading list as prescribed in your post-tour email. You see, in our marketing, what you didn't realize is we advertised this as a Halloween treat, but when you got here, you're now learning that your mandatory required reading list is your Halloween trick. Enjoy.
Nice.
So in this book, Houdini outlines how he came to be against spiritualism and even gives his thoughts on his frenemy, literary giant Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you know, the man who is responsible for Sherlock Holmes. In 1920, Houdini traveled to New York to London for his performance at the London Palladium, where he met Doyle, another student of spiritualism like himself. Houdini was willing to believe that some mediums were real, while Doyle agreed that some were frauds, but he definitely knew the real ones. Doyle visited Houdini in New York several times throughout the course of their friendship. You'll see here in this slide, they're on a joint family vacation in Atlantic City. Please note they're totally normal beach wear. I know myself that when I choose to wear fur, it's definitely to the beach because my favorite activity is definitely combing out all of the grains of sand out of my jacket, which seems reasonable. While they were there, the Doyles set up a seance with a real medium to speak to Houdini's mother. The Doyles were very impressed, but Houdini was not. But like any great friend would do, he was grateful, he said thank you, and he concealed his skepticism. However, Doyle could not keep his mouth shut, and he told the press that he converted Houdini to spiritualism, which then forced Houdini to publicly explain. This is where the friction really began. Houdini began touring, exposing mediums to the public, as pictured here, and he also attended seances in disguise, which was very extra. He claimed to visit over 100 mediums in his lifetime, which when you consider that he didn't have Google to look them up is pretty impressive. And like many a popular trope of friendship spoiled, a woman came between them by the name of Marjorie, or Miss Mina Crandon, and she was the proverbial straw on the ghost's back.
Is that a saying?
It is now. We copyright that. Put on a shirt. Doyle thought she was real, leading Houdini to debunk Marjorie's gift publicly. Ouch. Doyle strongly believed that Houdini himself was a medium in denial, headed down a very dangerous path, stating, "The spirit world might well be incensed against him using psychic powers at the very time he was attacking them." Houdini also made a monograph showcasing how Doyle plagiarized Edgar Allan Poe, but decided not to publish it. He ended up testifying before Congress in support of a bill outlawing fortune telling. Spoiler alert, didn't pass due to Tea Party opposition, obviously. And in 1925, he sued Doyle for slander. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is such a cool, spooky story, but how does it relate to Halloween? Well, unfortunately for Houdini, he died suddenly on October 31st, 1926. Woo! His wife, Bess, was so bereft over Houdini's death that she herself, more than likely against his spectral wishes, hosted a seance. She offered a prize of $25,000, which when you do the inflation math, I know, I did math twice, it's a lot. We do the inflation math for today, it's the equivalent of about $434,000. So like if you round up, basically like a cool $500,000. To any medium that was able to contact his spirit and prove it. After the first seance was unsuccessful, they began an annual tradition meeting every Halloween and hosting the Houdini seance in hopes to make contact. And after several unsuccessful years, she officially hosted the last Houdini seance in 1936. Doyle ended up dying on July 7th, 1930, but he never lost faith that his former bestie was the greatest physical medium of modern times. And while the Houdinis might be eternally resting in a cemetery in Cypress Hill, Queens, fans of Houdini have kept the tradition alive, and all over the world, they host an annual Houdini seance on Halloween, as seen from these posters here, and there's even a vinyl recording of one. And this year, which will be the 97th year, the seance will be held in Charleston, South Carolina at Holy City Magic. So all of us are obviously going on a road trip in a mystery lit pub crawl cargo van, and we'll see you there in 4 days?
4 days time.
You got to make them right now.
Thank you, Danielle. That was great. I love that. And I'm looking forward to reading some of Houdini's books about mysticism. This next transition, I have to give you a little bit of a caveat. This was written by Justin Steve, and it was done by him last year, and I felt to pay homage to Mr. Steve, I will read his transition, and I'm apologizing in advance. But he says, "I hope everyone is settling in and enjoying our Halloween tour so far. If not, we can always say the magic words, abracadabra, to put you in the proper mood." That is just a joke. But of course, our incantations might cause problems in the local morgue, but hopefully you locked your front door before joining, right? Right? But with that being said, let's move on to chapter 2, which I have horribly entitled, "What's Going On?" If you would please, Herb.
I don't know how to respond to that title, but I do appreciate it. I might also counter your joke, Eric, who you accused Justin of putting there. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Owl.
Owl who?
Correct. Okay, so when I was preparing for you're welcome.
Oh, my daughters, thank you in advance.
Now, when I was preparing for this tour, I really dug deep and I asked myself, what keeps me up at night? In my early adolescence, there were 2 things that were the source of my nightmares: Jurassic Park and Edith Wharton. Yes, Edith Wharton. Now, I know many of us, when we think of her, we see the glittering gowns and the balls, the dog lover, and the gossip girl of the Gilded Age. But I see a face. I see a cold, hollowed, haunting face elicited by the required reading of her tragic novel, Ethan Frome. Now, there are no ghosts or vampires that you would typically see in a Gothic novel, but Wharton masterfully produces the same haunting effect by layering tension and suspense with her religious attention to repetition. And what I didn't realize until looking back at the book, it was her constant descriptions of Xena and Maddie's faces, which makes sense why they stick in my head.
Yeah, help this.
What are you doing over there?
I'm just playing around with this woman's face. I love that slide.
Haunting, right? Thanks.
I'm sorry.
More nightmares.
Xena and Maddie's faces,
which we have here, beautifully laid out. And Maddie's face is often described as being reflected by light or kindled and sparkling like pure glitter on the snow, whereas Xena is gray and sallow, sharpened and bloodless. Now, by the time that you reach the image of Xena's ghastly face at the pivotal moment that dooms them all forever, it's like a still out of a Kubrick film. It's something you can never unsee. And she says, suddenly his wife's face, with twisted, monstrous lineaments, thrust itself between him and his goal. Now, in the final scene, the two faces become one, with the same lexicon being used for both women, sallow and sharpened, with pale, opaque eyes which revealed nothing and reflected nothing. Terrifying. Now, Edith Wharton wrote about 85 or so stories, and if you look into them, most of them do have supernatural elements. So I started asking myself, where did our high society gal get her inspiration from? Was it her close relationship with Turn of the Screw writer, Henry James, who actually, it was this day that they started their correspondence, October 26, way back 1900. Or perhaps it was her admiration of Gothic lit by the likes of Balzac or Nathaniel Hawthorne or Poe. I don't know if you can actually see that. It says Nevermore. Or perhaps it was just that good old Victorian obsession with death. Now, if you've joined our Christmas tours, I'm glad you appreciate that, Eric. We've talked about how a popular Yuletide and social tradition is to tell ghost stories around a fire with your friends. And it was quite common for authors to also indulge in writing the same. Now, there are certainly similarities in her work to those authors that I mentioned and also to the Victorian traditions. However, there are other instances in her life suggesting that, I don't know, maybe her ghost stories, just like her other works, were based on real life personal encounters. I'm gonna just take a drink real quick to that one.
Oh my goodness, yeah, that's a little heavy.
Ooh. Now, despite her privileged circumstances, her childhood was not always an easy one. She was born right here in New York City, but she also notoriously hated New York and has often described its intolerable ugliness and the damage it does to one's soul. Yes, Eric, that's correct.
Why am I wearing a pumpkin on my head?
Because it's Halloween. I wanted to give you a little costume. Now, she was in the nicest part of town, in a brownstone on Fifth Avenue at 14 West 23rd Street. As a child, she was often sick and isolated. She caught typhoid multiple times, and she lived next door to a murder house. Yeah, so perhaps worst of all, on top of that, were the silly books that were banned in her house growing up. Her strict mother was worried that these foolish distractions would mar her chances at securing a good marriage. Not the murder house, the books, in case that was not clear. Now, as for the murder, it was a dark and stormy night in 1870. That was a thunder thing that they use in theaters, by the way.
Universal sign for thunder. Yeah, we were all right.
Yeah. Well, sidebar, when I did Christmas Carol as a child, that was like the coveted role, was shaking the thunder sheet. I still aspire to that. So it was 1870, and Edith's next door neighbor, Benjamin Nathan, a prominent member of society, was bludgeoned to death in his own home. Now, the key testimony actually came from his 22-year-old son, Washington, or Wash, and it also, lucky for us, doubles as an Edith Wharton walking tour because their families attended all of the same social events and gatherings. Now, his many alibis, including strolling down Fifth Avenue with a couple of gals, popping into the Fifth Avenue Hotel, a little bite at Delmonico's, the Academy of Music, he was very busy that evening, and the St. James Hotel, followed by a brief stop at a brothel, which is actually the only stop not on Edith Wharton's walking tour, before arriving home around 1 a.m. Now, he claimed that on his way to his own room, he saw his father sleeping in his study. And then when he got up in the morning, he saw that the front door to the house was strangely wide open. He immediately goes to wake up his father, but upon entering the study, he encountered a gruesome, bloody scene where his father's lifeless body lay bludgeoned. Now, there was a lengthy trial, including a rather scandalous testimony from a prostitute. Now, while the murder remains unsolved today, many fingers, of course, pointed to his son, Washington, especially because, and this is weird, within just a few years of the murder, this 22-year-old guy's hair mysteriously turned stark white. Guilty. Now, Edith's, right? Yeah, that's weird. Edith's family was abroad when the murder happened, but it would have largely influenced her daily life when they returned to New York because the scene was so horrific. It was touted as one of the worst murders that had happened in New York City. It was all over the papers and it drew in crowds, in droves, like our tours would do, just to catch a glimpse of the infamous murder mansion. And the home remained vacant for decades afterwards because of the heinous crime. No one wanted to live there. Now today, it is a veggie grill. So enjoy your paninis at the murder house. My good friend Michael took that picture for us. Now, the Fifth Avenue Hotel mentioned in the testimony, situated right across the street from those apartments, has been featured in Edith's short story, New Year's Day. And it was extravagant. It was the social hub for the Upper Set at that time. And it was also cursed. Apparently, when they began construction, they dug up several skeletons. One might say they made a grave mistake. I could barely get that one out. It hurt. Now, speaking of skeletons, on the other side of her child apartment was and still is Madison Square Park. Perfect spot to play as a kid, former site of a potter's field where about 1,000 bodies were buried during the yellow fever epidemic, most of them which came from asylums. Yeah, so we've established that Edith basically grew up in a graveyard and she shared walls with a gruesome murder. And in a section she omitted from her autobiography, she also discusses her experience with typhoid at great length. She suffered for weeks. She was told she was going to die. She survived, but she relapsed. And then when she finally came to, she said, and these are her exact words, "I entered a world haunted by formless horrors, and I was terrorized by some dark, undefinable menace, forever following me, lurking and threatening." It was so bad that she couldn't sleep at night without a light on, and she confessed to even burning any books that were in the house that contained a ghost story. Now, with typhoid, I did look this up, and one may experience hallucinations, although it's actually pretty rare. And then those symptoms only last for a few weeks after recovery. For Edith, these typhoid symptoms lasted until she was 27 or 28 years old, she says. Now, then we have the home that she built and lived in, known as the Mount in the Berkshires. And it is also notoriously haunted, with countless stories from every tenant who ever lived there after her, and was also featured on Ghost Hunters. Now, it was in this house that she had another superstition. She would always point her slippers to one wall in the bedroom when she was sleeping at night. And when asked why, she said, to keep the hobgoblins from watching me while I slept. Yeah, lots of ick, creepy moments here. Now, she's also written about her unique ability to communicate with animals, maybe a nod to Danielle's mesmerism section. Who knows, maybe she read some of that. And now, forever a dog lover, she said that she could even sense what her dogs were saying and feeling, and also what they had experienced in their past lives. Yeah, so whether she had some sixth sense, or if it was her self-ascribed intense Celtic sense of the supernatural, or just hallucinations from typhoid, we may never know. But lucky for us, our dear confessional author, she used her senses and she wrote a whole collection of absolutely thrilling ghost stories. Now, in her introduction, she mentions that deep within us, the ghost instinct lurks, and we have the ability to feel the ghostly presence, and that one just needs continuity and silence to get there. So with that, I leave you with an excerpt from her story Afterward, which I also encourage you to read in silence on your own after the tour. And yes, it will be on our required reading list. Eric, if you'll take away the quote for me.
Then of a sudden, she was seized by a vague dread of the unknown. She had closed the door behind her on entering, and as she stood alone in the long, silent, shadowy room, her dread seemed to take shape and sound, to be there audibly breathing and lurking among the shadows. Her short-sighted eyes strained through them, half discerning an actual presence, something aloof that watched and knew. And in the recoil of that intangible propinquity, she threw herself suddenly on the bell rope and gave it a desperate pull.
Oh, thank you, Eric.
Very, very nice. Thank you, Herb. That was very well put together, and I love the quote. And it was honestly, before doing this, I was completely unaware that Edith Wharton wrote anything about horror stories or spook stories or whatnot. So that's another really neat side to a very interesting woman. Her dabbling in diabolical diatribes, if you will. It does remind me, though, of another disturbing story that I once read about a ship, about a pirate ship, and a bovine revolution that happened. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the tale. It is called Mutiny on the Bounty.
And this is where the tour ends.
Mutiny on the Bounty. We should do a toast. I'm sorry. I told you, Danielle, the jokes are not going to get better. They're only going to get worse here. If you have a glass and you'd like to join us for a Halloween toast, probably the most common Halloween toast would be to evil. But that seems kind of dark and short. So instead, how about here's to the witches, here's to the cats, here's to the hoot owls and whirring bats, here's to the ghosties in robes of white, here's to the thrills of Halloween night. Cheers. Now, as we prepare for chapter 3, Rebecca, I do have a response to your knock knock joke, and that would be knock knock.
Who's there?
Boo.
Boo hoo.
Don't cry. It's just a joke.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you, Eric. And don't cry. There won't be any more jokes.
I love it, though. I love it. All right. So now turn your lights down low and prepare yourself for some poltergeists of the past as we give you chapter 3. Be gone, you foul beast. And I'm not sure who we have for our host. Is this who do we have with us there? Who's inside today?
Sorry, I was frozen there for a moment at that joke. It stunned me. Stunned. I couldn't even respond. Well, to be very, Eric is asking which personality you're getting. This is Gonyo is my cousin. Thank you. Wow. Some people say we look alike. I don't see the resemblance, but my name is Professor Mortimer. Hello, happy to be here. Yes, that's me right there out on the streets of Greenwich Village by the Washington Memorial Arch. It's at the end of one of my fabulous tours, hauntedmanhattan.com. Come get your literary buzz on with the pub crawl, and then stick around the village for a ghost tour with us right afterward. So while the village is my usual haunt, it's always a pleasure to be nice and warm at home with a cat by my side. He's back there. Stack of dusty old books here in my dusty old basement, and a brew, of course. In the interest of trying to redeem the joke game here, because Eric is just killing it, and not in the good way, as the kids say. Here's a good one. What did the bartender say to the overly garrulous spider? Hey there, Legsy. Now that is some yarn you're spinning me. Okay, mine aren't any better. Okay, never mind. Okay, so
but I wasn't in the script. I wasn't ready for that. I'm like, wait a minute.
I'm trying.
Are you going to tell the other spider one?
Well, okay. So what do you call a spider with 20 eyes? Spy Ider. My kids, my preschool kids aren't here to laugh at it this time. So anyway, hopefully someone out there in the internet is laughing. So
Freya enjoyed it last night. She laughed quite a bit on that one. Took her a second to process.
I was surprised my kids got it. I was pretty impressed. So last year when we did this, I spoke about one of my favorite writers, Providence's own bespectacled weird fiction master, Howard Phillip, better known as H.P. Lovecraft. There he is, who, like Edith Wharton, I have just learned, famously hated New York. For Lovecraft, it was probably because in the 2 short years that he lived here, he wasn't very lucky in love. His marriage was very short-lived. He wasn't very lucky in work. His wasn't selling many stories, and the usually prolific HP actually wrote only 5 short stories in the time that he was living here. And also, well, you might have heard that he was famously uncomfortable with anyone and anything that wasn't upper class, Anglo-centric, and white. So we're talking about New York City in the 1920s, crossroads of the universe. Yeah. Anyway, so this year I'm not going to focus on Lovecraft. We're going to talk about the incredible literature that inspired his work and some of the incredible works that have followed out of that same tradition, all of which run through our fair metropolis, New York City. So first we got to talk about Robert Chambers. No, not that one, not the so-called preppy killer. I'm talking about Robert W. Chambers. If you've ever seen True Detective season 1, that's the good one, the one with Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey. Yeah, if you paid really, really close attention, you might, or maybe you just read the internet discourse around this, you might have heard mentions of Hastur and the Yellow King. And the Yellow King was the deity worshipped by the Twisted Tuttle cult, the main antagonists of the story, as well as reference to the fabled Carcosa, which in the show, they give that name to the stone ruins that you see in the last episode of the season. Well, pulp culture aficionados may be shocked to learn that writer Nick Pizzolatto borrowed those terms from literature. Take that, HBO, books rule. Anyway, so specifically, these come from the fiction of Robert W. Chambers, The King in Yellow. This collection is from 1895. It begins with 4 short stories revolving around the title. Interestingly, though, by the end, it's like romance stories, which is kind of wild. But it starts out basically setting up the greatest horror mythos in American literature. Anyway, so the King in Yellow can either refer to a malevolent supernatural entity or the play of the same name. In Chambers' fiction, anyone who reads the play, The King in Yellow, is driven mad by the end of the 2nd act. Now, that sounds a lot like a lot of the plays that Eric has invited me to that he's been in over the years. But anyway, I digress. So 2 of the stories are set right here in New York. In the first one, this is one of my favorites. It's called The Repairer of Reputations. It's set in the future of 1920s America. And then the narrator relates in the first person that the country at this point is doing great. All sorts of architectural and social progress, largely driven by super discriminatory and racist acts by the government. We soon learn, though, that because of an accident he had falling from a horse that resulted in a head injury, our narrator, a man named Hildred, he was laid up for a while. And while he was laid up, he was doing some reading. Guess what he read? Yeah, you guessed it, The King in Yellow. But he doesn't seem quite mad, does he, as he recounts this story? He's only collaborating with a strange man who lives down on Bleecker Street, who claims to be the architect of a vast conspiracy to install Hildred as the heir to the last king of the imperial dynasty of America, descended from a lost kingdom within stars in the higher days. Yeah, okay. If you've ever heard that, remember that term, unreliable narrator, from your English classes? Yeah, that's it. This is a really good example right here. Anyway, the story is about Hildred believing that he needs to kill his cousin, a military man by the name of Lewis, because Lewis might challenge him for the throne. It's tense. It's super weird. It's super interesting. And it's always disturbed me for one key detail, which will come up again later in this lecture. He describes the institution of what he calls lethal chambers, basically government-run facilities where one could commit suicide. Chambers describes the very first one as having been opened on Washington Square, he writes. The very thought of such a facility is absolutely terrifying enough. But for me personally, shortly after I reread this story a few years back, this building right here, this appeared on the south end of Washington Square Park. And I immediately thought, oh my God, that's what it looks like in my brain. Don't worry, I was wrong. It's not that. It's just the offices for the park, as well as some restrooms, or so they say. If I ever see the yellow sign spray painted on there at any point, I may never do a tour in the village again. Now, back to Hastur and Carcosa and whatnot. Hastur is sometimes the name of a place. It's sometimes an idea or a symbol representing that idea. See that symbol right there? Or Hastur is himself the king in yellow, that malevolent interdimensional being. Or he's simply a god of humble shepherds, because that's how we started. Robert W. Chambers brought that name Hastur into it says Hastur in case that's not coming across. He brought it into his weird fiction world from the work of Ambrose Bierce, specifically a short story called Haita the Shepherd, which isn't really a horror tale at all, unless you find the idea of never finding happiness horrifying. Anyway, Bierce also created Carcosa, which before it described a terrifying otherworldly place of nightmares, or was the name given to a place where indescribable acts of depravity are committed by a cult in True Detective. Carcosa was simply the name of a place in a dream had by the protagonist of Bierce's short story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa. What I'm getting at is, Bierce came up with these terms for people and places in his fiction. And then a fan sort of remixed them, built on them in their own fiction, you know, wicka remix, and so on, until now we have these fantastic terms to describe incredibly rich ideas and worlds of everyone's shared creation. Of course, Lovecraft, he had to come back at some point, right? Lovecraft and his acolytes borrowed those terms, and they added more names of mythical books and gods and places and interdimensional horrors. But I talked a ton about Lovecraft last year, so he's the name most folks have heard before, so we don't need to go deeper in there. But I have to just mention him because it's through him that all these other great writers take inspiration. And I personally find all of this amazing and inspiring, because thankfully this remixing is still happening to this day. Stories in what's become somewhat incorrectly named the Cthulhu mythos, they're constantly being written. Modern authors like John Langan, if you haven't read The Fisherman, oh my goodness, I envy you get to read it for the first time. Ruth Anna Emrys, even the king himself. Yes, all of them have spent time playing in this particular cosmic literary sandbox of horror. And it's always expanding and it's always wonderful. One particular that I have to suggest, if you're a fan of graphic novels, highly recommend checking out Alan Moore's stories in The Courtyard, Neonomicon, and Providence. Though I have to give the requisite content warning here. This gets literally graphic, especially in Neonomicon. If Lovecraft was known for merely suggesting the horror and like letting you imagine how it could be, Moore and his artist collaborator Jason Burrows take the opposite tact. It's all on the page, and it's disturbing. Providence, in particular, which acts as both a prequel to the previous two stories, as well as its conclusion, it ties together a lot of these mythos threads. It begins in that 1920s New York that Chambers had envisioned in 1895, right down to the lethal chambers. Here they're referred to as exit gardens, and they're a key part of kicking off the action of the story. It follows a reporter by the name of Robert Black. Pretty cheeky on Moore's part. That's a play on the name of Robert Bloch, a real writer who corresponded and took great influence from the real H.P. Lovecraft at a young age. So Black sets out on an assignment to write a story about a book called Suleiman, which purportedly drives its readers insane. Sound familiar? Yeah. As the story unfolds, Black runs basically like Forrest Gump style into many events that from Lovecraft's canon, including the strange, deathly cold man living in an air-conditioned apartment on 14th Street. Yeah, that's taken from Lovecraft's Cool Air, which is in itself an homage to Edgar Allan Poe's The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, and eventually relates all those stories to a young author. Yep, guess whom he meets in Providence? H.P. himself. See, it's all tied together. Pepe Silva! Pepe Silva! If you didn't get that joke. I'm sorry, but I had to do it. Anyway, so speaking of connections, I recommended this last year, but I'm going to mention it again because it's well worth a read. One of my favorite Lovecraft tales is set in Brooklyn, not far from where Lovecraft lived on State Street. There he is standing in front of it. You can see this house, actually, and hear more about Lovecraft's time as a New Yorker on the Literary Pub Crawl's Brooklyn tour, by the way. So the story is called The Horror at Red Hook, and while it's genuinely a great horror story, it's also very overtly racist in its depictions of the people who lived in that area of town. Remember what I said about Lovecraft? Kind of scared of anyone who didn't look like him. Might be part of why he wrote great horror. He was terrified all the time. So it's a wonderful turn of the tables when New York author Victor LaValle uses Lovecraft's terrifying tale and his terribly racist attitudes within it, and he twists them and gives us the perspective of the oppressed. His novella is called The Ballad of Black Tom, follows a man from Harlem who's mixed up in the events of the horror at Red Hook, but here the horrors and terrors being summoned from beyond are nothing to the protagonist, because compared to what he's lived with here on Earth, that ain't nothing. A quick little bit from that story. I bear a hell within me, Black Tom growled, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. You're a monster, then, Malone said. I was made one. Great stuff. Highly recommended. It's basically an anti-racist Cthulhu mythos story. So cool. What is so grand to me about all this literature is that it's all myth-making, where incidental names borrowed from one work can become central places or characters or otherworldly gods in another. As writer Robert M. Price put it in The Hastur Cycle, a collection that helps collate all these various threads from Hastur-related stories. He writes, another implication of the mythic character of the mythos is that it is meaningless to speak of an original, of a given tale or myth or epic, when we find variant versions, abridged or composite epics or whatever. There's no way to choose one and declare it the true original, the definitive version. Each tale is a link in a chain, part of an evolving cycle. Each performance of the myth is a new original, so to speak. With that, I will leave you with this. There is nothing new under the sun. What is your source material to build on, to create your new work of genius? I hope you find it. I'm going to go look for mine after the tour in a game of pinball.
Thank you, Professor Mortimer or Robert Gonyo or whomever you are at the moment. Always enlighten the darkness with your stories. You can catch more of his blood-curdling knowledge as the professor and his colleagues at the hauntedmanhattan.com. .com reminds me of some rather wealthy spirits I met once. They had made their money in the .com. Ooh. Genius. Just genius. Okay, I'd love to share more of these stories at Halloween, but we're trying to keep it on schedule, so I think it's kind of best to move on to Chapter 4, Gorn, but not forgotten. Miss Rose Merritt.
All right, not too bad, not too bad. You know, guys, this is so us. We've been chatting like loons for this entire presentation, thinking we were being really funny for all of you. And we only just realized that we've only been chatting amongst ourselves. So, you know, good job for us.
Riveting stuff in that chat. Riveting stuff.
There was some gold in there, guys. Oh man. Oh well. Well, since we haven't mentioned it, I don't think yet, just so you guys know, there is a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or anything about anything we've covered, feel free to drop it in there. Just putting in a little plug there. I know we're probably going to go a little over. Hope that's okay with you guys, but there's some good stuff left. We promise you we won't keep you too long. And with that, I will turn to this gentleman here. The next slide. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Edward Gorey. Now, maybe I don't have to explain to our viewers who this guy is. After all, he was brought to our attention of many viewers like us some time ago. But one thing I should stress before we get started is that Edward Gorey was a cat fan, hence this. Very much a cat fan, to put it mildly. oh boy, was he a fan. And apparently they were a fan of his. So you've got some photos here. By the way, I tried to replicate the first couple of photos here, and it went something like this. Not too successful, but I'll keep trying, guys. I can only aspire to the kind of zen that I suppose Gorey had and his control over the cats. But I digress. More to the point for our purposes, let's take a brief tour of macabre Manhattan and talk about Gorey's New York. Now, contrary to popular belief, Edward, or Ted as he was known to his friends, was neither English nor Victorian nor long dead nor really a deeply tragic figure. Twisted, perhaps, but not really tragic. He was an enigma for sure, but there are some things that we know about him. He was born in Chicago, 1925, raised in Florida, which may seem kind of strange, but having grown up in a hot climate myself, I can understand how you might retreat mentally to cold landscapes and Gothic tales and that sort of thing. But after growing up in Florida, he served for a time in the war, World War II in Utah, then he was educated at Harvard before landing in New York in 1953. At 36 East 38th Street in a neighborhood called Murray Hill, Ted lived for decades in a quiet back room on the second floor, alone, somewhat monastic, and surrounded by just what you might expect, except maybe on a less urbane scale. Tumbling heaps of literally thousands of books, not one, not two, but several cats, and various collector's items, both ancient and odd. As a book cover illustrator initially, first for Doubleday, then Anchor Books, Gorey was finally able to unleash this sort of Victorian, sort of Edwardian, sort of Jazz Age style that was so uniquely his own, with a little homoeroticism thrown in. Okay, why not? Raised on the classic Gothic novels of the Victorian period, as well as the wildly unpredictable lyricism of folks like Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll, Ted managed to fuse the two together to create an enduring style that you might call macabre absurdism. He proclaimed, "There's so little heartless work around. So I feel I'm filling a small but necessary gap." And in his view, all the best nonsense is shadowed by sadness. By night, you could find Gorey mingling with various New York Illuminati at the New York City Ballet, where, no kidding, for well over 20 years, Gorey apparently didn't miss a single performance. And by day, Gorey roamed the streets of New York, clad in floor-length fur coats, jangling bracelets, sneakers, and always his iconic beard. One particular haunt was the Gotham Bookmart, I can do it. Located at 41 West 47th Street in the middle of Midtown's Diamond District. Opened in 1920, the bookstore, which alas closed its doors for good in 2007, which is a growing epidemic in New York, but I digress. You could count the likes of George Gershwin, George O'Keeffe, Woody Allen, John Updike, and Katharine Hepburn as regulars. And in fact, it was known that at one point, H.L. Mencken and Theodore Dreiser, quote, one fine day rolled in full of beer and gaiety and proceeded to sign their own books, embellishing them with long inscriptions. And it was here, really, that Gorey's little books, as he called them, of poison pen tales of tragedy and child murder, first made their appearance. Some examples.
Each night father fills me with dread. When he sits on the foot of my bed, I'd not mind that he speaks in gibbers and squeaks, but for 17 years he's been dead.
There's a rad other couple in Hertz who are cousins, or so each asserts. Their sex is in doubt, for they're never without their mustaches and long trailing skirts.
Of course, one of Ted's most notable works was his deliciously diabolical Gashly Crumb Tinies, an ABC Darien. I'll say that again, ABC Darien. We've all learned a new word today, in which each letter reveals the grisly and yet perversely delightful death of an unfortunate child, such as I is for Ida, who drowned in the lake. J is for James, who took lie by mistake. M is for Maud, who was swept out to sea. N is for Neville, who died of ennui. Y is for York, whose head was knocked in. And my particular favorite, which I actually have framed next to my bar, Z is for Zilla, who drank too much gin. A cautionary tale for us all. So, despite his larger-than-life persona, to be sure, Ted lived much of his life on the page, in the worlds he conjured up with pen and ink, and did most of his adventuring, they say, between his ears. He was by no means a well, actually, this is an enduring theme we're finding during this presentation, right? He was not a dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker. He really didn't care much for New York that much. Seems like a general antipathy toward New York, but also a love of cats is kind of like this theme that we have going on here.
It really is, yeah.
But despite that, he actually lived 30 plus years here. But in his kind of downspoken sort of way of talking about it, he said it's just another place with better bookstores and more movies to go to. No, an Anglophile at heart, the one who never actually bothered to visit the place, Ted eventually lived out the rest of his days in Cape Cod, giving puppet shows and continuing to add to his menagerie of curiosities. As for the work itself, it's full of dualisms, presenting stories both marvelous and pointless, serious, frivolous, poetic, and poisonous. Or my own word for it, scare-adorable. Just testing that. At its core, something that was central to Gorey's creative philosophy was its ability to allow its readers the freedom to fill in the gaps within its willfully ambiguous language and presentation. And whether they admit to it or not, many creators are indebted to the popularization of the macabre that Gorey enabled, the likes of Neil Gaiman, Tim Burton, Alison Bechdel, Daniel Handler, who authored the Lemony Snicket books, and even Wes Anderson, as you see here. So, to end things, I suppose it's appropriate to paraphrase a line from one of Gorey's own little books, The Utter Zoo. About Ted Gorey, what can be said? There was just one, and now he's dead. By the way, quick plug, going into the mandatory reading list, an excellent book came out a few years ago, Born to be Posthumous, about Edward Gorey. As I mentioned before, there's not a whole lot known about him, not a whole lot written about him, strangely enough, and there's not much that he divulged himself. But Mark Derry did a great job of pulling together all of the information he could. It's a really enjoyable read. So if you have any interest in Edward Gorey, it's a really great tome about his life and contributions.
Nice. That was great, Rose. And I've always loved Edward Gorey. And there's actually a play version about his Little the Ghastly Clementines that is quite good. They did it in my college, and it was probably one of the best student-directed plays out there. Looking at the time, I do think I want to keep things moving and jump ahead to the last bit. I did have a little bit of an anecdote that I was going to tell about a vampire, but it does get a little long in the tooth. So I will skip that story and move right on to our final chapter. Chapter 5, Rise of the Brockmann.
You know, we don't have a toast here, but if you want to take a shot along with me because you feel like you just need it, now's your time. Cheers. So I want to make sure that we talk so much about the past that we're bringing this into context today in, what is it, 2023, right?
I think so.
Is that what it is, Eric?
I think so, yeah. Not for much longer.
Well, it's hard for me because, you know, I've been summoned. So dates, times, locations, difficult. So given what we've learned today, I want you to be very certain in the fact that there was and still is big money in exposing mediums. If you walk around any New York City neighborhood, you will see neon psychic storefronts, usually offering you a very low rate of a $5 palm read. However, once they get you in the door, a disastrous money pit awaits you. Now, I'm not saying that there are no real psychics in New York. I might happen to know one or two. But I am saying that New York City real estate is really expensive, and psychics do not make enough money to rent a storefront on 7th Avenue without something else happening on the inside. The main pipeline for psychic scammers is between New York City and Palm Beach. And sometimes they end up conning up to $700,000 from clients. The real psychics you will find on Yelp with disclaimers that fortune telling is for entertainment purposes only, as per the law. So when is fortune telling a crime? Is it when the rich are scammed out of large sums of money? Is it when the poor are scammed into debt? Or is it just when the government didn't get their little cut off the top in the form of taxes? In New York State, the answer is crystal clear. Under Penal Law Section 165.35, fortune telling. As you can see here, it tells you specifically when it's allowed and when it's not. But it's definitely allowed for amusement, like today. So I want to play a little game, and we're going to call it, Is It a Scam?
Ooh, exciting.
How you do this Halloween. This is the most exciting part of our tour, which is why we saved it for last. Also, I can't see any of our audience members, so I don't know what your answers are going to be, but I'm just going to try to sense them, right, with my powers from the Ouija board. Okay, here we go. Psychic Gina, this lady, aka Tammy Vlado White, approaches you on the street and says, "There is evil surrounding you." And she has a candle for $600 that can fix it. And it's not even Yankee Candle. Scam?
No, it's legit. It's legit.
Yeah. Good luck, Eric. Good luck to you. You are out with friends in Greenwich Village and walk past Zena Clairvoyant, aka Sylvia Mitchell, on the corner of 7th Avenue South and Bleecker Street. Or you see her at one of her other shops in Mystic, Connecticut or Naples, Florida. Real towns that are just very poor and not affluent at all. This shop in Greenwich Village is 2 stories tall. And did I say it's in Greenwich Village? Scam?
It's been there for a while. I had my fortune read there back in 1998. So she's probably got like a rent-controlled spot there.
And
she's totally legit. Right? Totally legit.
Sorry for your loss, Eric. Becca is the grand winner today. Or whatever the weird nickname you gave Becca today was. Herb? Is that what it is?
Herb.
Yeah.
Rebecca Ross Bailey. Herb, for sure.
Some say Becca Ross Bailey is BRB. And on that
there
note,
you go. Yeah. Whoa.
So this is our last one. You guys really got to get it this time. It's important spiritually. You visit Priscilla Kelly Del Maro, aka Christina Alvarez, at 253 West 43rd Street, and she says she can reincarnate your dead ex-girlfriend for the low price of a Rolex. And if that doesn't work, she can sell you a bridge in the afterlife to communicate with her. Scam? That's her going to jail. Scam. So if you happen to fail that game, like Eric, don't fret, because Gotham has a new hero hailed by The Guardian as America's psychic crime fighter and former NYPD detective and current private eye. You see big money in psychic busting. Bob Nygaard. He's made it his life work to end the New York City to South Florida psychic scammer pipeline and has convicted scammers, all of them in our game, for their crimes. Perhaps the spirit of Houdini does live on after all in both psychics real, me, and less real, and in the authorities who thought their efforts. And if you're looking to visit a real medium this year, you can book your visit to Lilydale in upstate New York, which is a private hamlet that only spiritualists can live in, which is really cool. And we're definitely also taking a road trip there together.
Another road trip. I like it.
So much gas.
Break out the Airstream.
So this Halloween, when you're out donning your disguise for Houdini's annual seance before your animal sacrifice bonfire, make sure not to get lured in by the neon psychic signs, and don't mind the two friends arguing in front of the tea shop over mediums, for Keanu is always waiting for you on the subway ride home.
Good old Keanu, and not the Matrix guy. Well, thank you, Danielle. That was great, and that's pretty much it for our tour. Here we are at the epilogue, where I'm going to try to say goodbye, but I might get a little long in the tooth. But I think we here at the team, picture here together in a group shot we had put together, are really grateful for your participation in the tour. Obviously, we have tons of fun, and there's so much more we could do if we could only regale you for hours and hours and hours. But I know you all have lives and places to go at this time in the evening. But we did want to just kind of recap a few bullet points to make sure that we have some takeaways here. One of them is, of course, that the veil between the land of the dead and ours is shockingly permeable. And during Halloween, we should be very careful, make sure we are more lucky that other stuff doesn't happen. Cats are obviously minions. They're familiars. They're potent vessels for all manner of evil. They're sneaky, silent, sharp, and would eat us if we were smaller prey. However, they're also cute and fluffy, and we're bigger than them, so we win. Spiritualism and fortune telling are not to be dismissed if you look like Danielle, but again, if you're not on Yelp, perhaps you should be skeptical. Lastly, you should almost always avoid everything if you happen to be a child living near Edward Gorey. So with that, here is our reading list. Don't worry if you're rushing to try to get a screenshot right now. We will make sure that this is part of a follow-up email that you will receive if you are on Zoom. The recording of this will be posted on YouTube. So if you end up watching it on YouTube, you could pause and screenshot it then. You could also reach out to us and ask. We're always happy to respond back. You know, we're nice people in the end. So that being said, happy Halloween. Thank you for coming. Follow us again on Instagram, X, and Facebook at Lit Pub Crawl. We may begin to become more active there. Come to our website. Join our mailing list if you haven't already to find out about some other tours. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. We will certainly let you know when we have some other ones coming up. I think our Christmas holiday one will probably remount again. We're getting some new research in there, so we'll revamp that one. I hope you can join us to that, and hopefully we can see you on a real tour again sometime soon. But in the meantime,
can we
cheers. Remember, we're in it together, and come get lit with us again sometime.